Welcome back to Armpit Intellectuals, the podcast where we tackle uncomfortable truths, deconstruct systemic biases, and engage in critical dialogue about the world we live in. I'm Bilal, and as always, I'm joined by Zara.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for episode 15. Today's conversation addresses a pervasive yet often under-examined issue: colorism in Pakistan. It's a deeply rooted societal problem that intersects with colonial history, class structures, gender inequity, and our cultural obsession with Eurocentric standards of beauty and success. And this applies to much of South Asia. We'll be focusing on the Indian subcontinent. And there's much to unpack, so let's begin.
I think it's important to ground this discussion in lived experience because for most of us, our earliest encounters with colorism occur in childhood, within families, schools, and broader social spaces. Why don't you share your perspective?
So I spent some of my formative years outside Pakistan, in Dubai and later in Toronto. But every summer, I returned to an insulated world of manicured lawns, imported luxury, and dinner parties hosted in opulent homes. This segment of Pakistan's urban elite, a class I belonged to, was saturated with Western ideals. Westernization was aspirational. It was a marker of status, sophistication, and progress. Pakistani traditions and cultural aesthetics were often dismissed, deemed inferior or uncouth. Yet this privilege came with contradictions. We lamented social inequalities while remaining complicit in perpetuating class and racial hierarchies. I witnessed firsthand the differential treatment of domestic workers, children even, who were verbally and emotionally diminished, their darker skin serving as an unspoken yet overt marker of otherness. Alongside class, this was often due to an ethno-religious bias as well, denoting Christians and Hindus, Sindhis and Baloch people, particularly those of Pakistan's Shidi community, which is the largest African immigrant diaspora in all of South Asia, as those who have darker skin than upper-class Muslim Punjabis and Pashtuns. On the other hand, for many upper-class elite Pakistani men who came to the West, getting with a Gori seemed to be the ultimate goal for a while. But this played out back home as well, where men often idolized thin, light-skinned, and light-haired women. Classism and colorism operated in tandem and continue to do so, consolidating these hierarchies of power.
That's a poignant point. Before we continue, let's define colorism for listeners unfamiliar with the term. Colorism refers to prejudice and discrimination against individuals with darker skin tones, often within the same racial or ethnic community. In Pakistan, its pervasiveness stems from colonial legacies, societal structure, and cultural conditioning.
Right, yeah, I mean, my own relationship with colorism began early. Though I wasn't particularly dark-skinned, I was darker than my sister and many of my peers. And I still remember being called, quote-unquote, dirty because of it. I was no older than 8. And that singular comment catalyzed years of internalized shame and a subconscious yearning for fairness. And this is where privilege enters the equation. I had access to Fair and Lovely because my nanny used it. One of the most ubiquitous skin whitening products in South Asia. So Fair and Lovely, I mean, I'm sure people who listen to this will know what it is, but for those who don't, its advertisements constructed a harmful narrative. Fairness was the gateway to beauty, acceptance, and upward mobility, whether socially or class-wise. And what is the underlying message of this? That dark skin needed to be corrected. And it's a multi-billion-dollar industry fueled by societal insecurities and systemic bias. I've even had friends who were rejected by their boyfriend's mothers for marriage simply because ye to kali hai. Which is similar to how fatness is viewed too, right? Under the wedding industrial complex, especially.
Yeah, it is, for sure. And those advertisements are far from innocuous. As cultural critics Sajjalli notes, Image based consumerism links products to aspiration, exploiting existing insecurities. Fair skin becomes commodified, while darker skinned individuals are marginalized within both interpersonal and institutional settings.
Precisely. I mean, colorism transcends aesthetic preferences. It's an instrument of class mobility, especially for women. Many families invest considerable resources into fairness creams. I mean, that's just a basic example. The family doesn't, but you know what I mean? A lot of people do invest in, fairness creams because seeing light skin as an advantage for marriage, employability, and broader social acceptance, right? This normalization reveals how colorism operates as a systemic, profit driven form of discrimination.
But it's not just about individuals, this operates on a structural level too, in which darker skinned people are often excluded from opportunities, whether it's in the workplace, in social spaces, or in media representation. Let's dive deeper into that. In ancient Indian culture, dark skinned deities were revered as symbols of beauty, power, and divinity. For instance, Krishna, an incarnation of Lord Vishnu, derives his name from the Sanskrit word Krishna, meaning black or dark. Prabhu Sri Ram, another revered figure, is also described as having a dark complexion. Similarly, the goddess Kali, whose very name translates to black, embodies divine strength, protection, and fearlessness. These depictions demonstrate that ancient Indian ideals of beauty transcended skin color, focusing instead on virtues like character, wisdom, and valor.
And powerful figures like Draupadi from the Mahabharata were also described as dark skinned, further reinforcing that strength and significance were not defined by fairness. Even Lord Shiva, who adorned himself with dark ash, symbolized ideals that ran far deeper than physical appearance. In Vedic India, beauty, divinity, and strength flourished in all shades, and dark skin was seen not as a burden, but as a blessing. Unlike other societies where colorism took root, early Indian civilization embraced the richness of all complexions, making the concept of color based discrimination foreign to its cultural ethos.
To understand the roots of colorism in the Indian subcontinent, we must revisit the colonial past. During British rule, racial hierarchies were constructed to justify domination. Whiteness was positioned as the pinnacle of power, beauty, and civility, while darker skin was stigmatized. The British looked to the Greeks and Romans for their beauty idols, which obviously put fair skin, eyes, and hair at the forefront. But prior to this, the invasion of the Mughals marks the oppression by another foreign invader who had fairer skin than the local Indians, since they were essentially from Iran.
The works of revered poets like Rumi, Amir Khusro, and others, often celebrated for their spirituality and literary brilliance, also reflect the deeply entrenched colorism and racial hierarchies of their time. While their contributions to Persian and Islamic literature are undeniably significant, they simultaneously reveal biases that were pervasive in their cultural and historical context. Darker skinned people, particularly Indians, were frequently subjected to negative portrayals, with their skin color often being linked to undesirable traits or inferiority.
These depictions were not isolated but rather reflected broader societal attitudes that emerged from a confluence of cultural, political, and economic exchanges between Central Asia, Persia, and South Asia. The Persian literary tradition, admired for its poetry and mysticism, sometimes perpetuated these hierarchies by subtly or overtly associating light skin with beauty, purity, and virtue. while darker complexions were often portrayed as lesser or undesirable. This bias reveals how even the so called great poets of the time, despite their spiritual and philosophical insights, were not free from the prejudices that shaped their societies. By understanding these nuances, we can critically engage with these literary works, appreciating their artistic value while also
Learn.
acknowledging the prejudices they perpetuated. This duality reminds us that even revered cultural artifacts are products of their time, reflecting the complexities, contradictions, and injustices of the societies from which they emerged.
Post colonial theorists like Homi Bhabha and Franz Fanon argue that colonial power operates not only through political and economic control, but also through psychological subjugation. Whiteness became a standard against which identity, beauty, and worth were measured. This ideology persisted even after independence, aka partition, GAD. The colonial residue is evident in Pakistan's elite, who equated westernization with modernity and privilege. Figures like Winston Churchill harbored blatant disdain for Indians, famously referring to them as, quote unquote, a beastly people with a beastly religion. This sentiment was not confined to politics, but also deeply influenced the literature of the time, which often reflected and reinforced colonial prejudices. Rudyard Kipling, for instance, articulated this imperialist mindset through his concept of, quote unquote, white man's burden, portraying it as the moral duty of the British to civilize India. Indians were depicted as inferior beings in need of British governance to so called lift them from supposed savagery. Such narratives perpetuated racial hierarchies and justified colonial domination under the guise of benevolence.
Moreover, British literature of the colonial period frequently emphasized the word fair, not just as a descriptor of beauty, but as an ideal deeply intertwined with racial superiority. This repeated association underscored their singular obsession with fairness as the standard for beauty and virtue, further entrenching colorism and fostering a disdain for darker skin tones among colonized peoples. Such portrayals left a lasting impact on South Asia, shaping beauty ideals and societal perceptions that persist to this day. And this isn't limited to physical appearance. The emulation of Western lifestyles, whether through education, consumption patterns, or language, reinforced an implicit hierarchy. Affluence became associated with whiteness, and darker skinned individuals, particularly those from lower socioeconomic classes, were systematically dehumanized.
Let's also acknowledge the role of feudalism. Pakistan's feudal elites perpetuated colonial hierarchies, controlling land and resources while consolidating their power. Skin tone became another layer of stratification within this system, where Eurocentric standards further entrenched inequality.
The entrenchment of colonial ideologies has been so pervasive that even today, many of us still gravitate toward Western ideals of beauty, progress, and power. The idea of whiteness as the ultimate standard is embedded so deeply in our psyche that it almost becomes invisible.
And it's so ingrained that many people don't even recognize the damage it causes. The continued reliance on fairness products, despite growing awareness about their harmful effects, is a stark example of how colorism is not just a relic of colonialism, but a living, breathing issue that shapes our daily lives even today.
The gender dimension of colorism cannot be overstated. Women face disproportionate pressure to conform to fairness ideals, The fairness cream industry directly targets them, promising not just beauty but opportunities for social mobility. Campaigns featuring actresses like Aishwarya Rai equate lighter skin with romantic success, marriage, career advancement, and happiness.
सिर्फ पोज मारोगे तो कंधा बनकर रह जाओगे हैंडसम बन बंदा बन नया फेयर एंड हैंडसम फेयरनेस क्रीम मर्दों की सख्त त्वचा के लिए इसका 5 एक्शन फेयरनेस सिस्टम दे लॉन्ग लास्टिंग गोरापन नया फेयर एंड हैंडसम सिर्फ कंधा नहीं बंदा बन
Narratives that are both toxic and deeply exploitative.
It doesn't just stop at advertisements. Bollywood, Lollywood, and mainstream South Asian media perpetuate these ideals. Light skinned actresses and actors are celebrated, while darker skinned individuals are sidelined or subjected to lightening makeup to so called correct their appearance. This erasure reinforces damaging stereotypes and marginalizes an entire segment of the population.
What's significant is that this obsession cuts across class. Whether it's an affluent woman purchasing luxury whitening treatments or a lower income family investing in fairness products, the narrative remains consistent. Light skin equals value.
This obsession with fairness also reveals the anti Black prejudice within South Asian communities. By idolizing whiteness, we not only perpetuate self hatred, but actively participate in anti Black racism, a topic that demands further introspection.
In fact, this ties into a broader issue we see in the South Asian diaspora, particularly in Canada. As we engage with issues of race, it's important to recognize the intersection of colorism with racism faced by South Asians in the West. In a country like Canada, which prides itself on multiculturalism, South Asians still face racism that is deeply embedded in colorist attitudes.
On one end of the spectrum in Canada, many South Asians often experience what some might refer to as internalized racism, which equates being marginalized not only by white Canadians, but also by other racial minorities and South Asians who may harbor biases against darker skin tones. This form of intra-community colorism can be just as damaging, especially when individuals who face these prejudices are the same ones who are subjected to media and societal messages reinforcing Eurocentric beauty standards.
And what's troubling is that many South Asians in Canada, particularly those from more affluent backgrounds, tend to gravitate toward whitening products and lighter skin and hair beauty ideals as a way to fit in with Canadian and Western standards. This phenomenon isn't just a consumer issue, it's an identity issue. Darker skinned South Asians in the diaspora are often pushed to the margins, even within their own communities.
You see this in everyday interactions too. From the workplace to social gatherings, darker skinned South Asians are often passed over in favor of lighter skinned individuals when it comes to job opportunities, romantic relationships, and even social acceptance. The psychological toll of this can be immense, especially for younger generations trying to navigate their dual identities in an environment that still equates fairness with success. I mean, even when I've applied for jobs, there's always this awkwardness कि मेरा नाम देख के मुझे इंटरव्यू नहीं करेंगे. तुम्हें नहीं होता है ऐसे?
I mean, it's not that, it's just that even like how sometimes I know that just by the name that you have on your resume, you are filtered. You're more likely to get less interviews just based on the names because some of their systems now are sort of, you can say, racist in a way
Definitely.
because they have internalized biases.
Yeah.
So I know that in the corporate world it does happen. Like if your name is John Doe, you'll get way more interviews than if your name was
Muhammad Qasim.
Muhammad. Yeah, exactly. Or
Yeah,
Muhammad.
for sure.
So that's it. Yeah, that's, I think, a little different from colorism, but still,
Yeah, and I mean,
the name, the brownness, it represents everything.
right, and going back to colorism, pretty privilege among South Asians has a lot to do with being lighter skinned. But there are certainly some public figures. I think one of them is Simone Ashley. She was in Bridgerton. And some public figures are trying to break these patterns of oppression.
And it's just not a matter of personal experience. I mean, as you know, it's structural. The Canadian media landscape, even with its growing diversity, still tends to prioritize lighter skinned South Asians in films, TV shows, and advertisements. Or they cast actors who look specially brown so that they are more easily tokenized. This creates a sense of inferiority for darker skinned individuals and reinforces the idea that to be truly accepted in so called Canadian society, one must embody these Eurocentric ideals of beauty and success.
And the tragic part is that it becomes a self perpetuating cycle. The more these biases are normalized, the less we recognize them, and the harder it becomes to break the cycle of colorism. In a way, these attitudes mirror those in Pakistan, for example, where fairness is seen as a pathway to upward mobility and darker skin is seen as a barrier to success. Darker skinned individuals are unfairly and cruelly assumed to be rural and backward. There is undoubtedly a systemic prejudice against those with darker skin in Lollywood and Bollywood, obviously, as well as the added layer of nepotism that percolates these industries. I mean, even if you Google colorism Lollywood, you'll see how much actors within the industry themselves perpetuate this idea of, oh no, it's not colorism, it's not this, it's just you didn't get lucky, or you didn't get, you're not working hard enough
To get right?
to get into Lollywood.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, so let's see what's happening today in South Asia with colorism, and which continues to be a pervasive issue in South Asia, influencing societal norms and individual experiences. Recent events and discussions highlight both the persistence of this bias and the growing efforts to address it.
In India, the fairness cream industry has faced significant scrutiny. Brands like Fair and Lovely have been criticized for promoting lighter skin as a standard of beauty. In response to public pressure, Unilever, which is ironically or not to our colonial history a Dutch-British company, rebranded Fair and Lovely to Glow and Lovely in 2020.
Well, lovely.
It was so lovely, removing the word fair from its name.
That's fair.
That's fair. So lovely. However, critics argue that this change is superficial and does not tackle the underlying issue of colorism. Like, people are still buying Glow and Lovely, because they know it's fair and lovely.
Yeah. Yep. Similarly, in US, South Asian communities have been confronting colorism within their own ranks. The Black Lives Matters movement have prompted introspection among South Asians, leading to discussions about internal biases and the need for solidarity against all forms of racism.
And activists are leveraging social media platforms to challenge colorist norms. For instance, a Facebook group of South Asian women launched a petition against a dating site that used a filter to lighten users' skin tones. I don't have the name, but, this was as seen on a BBC article. The petition garnered over 1,500 signatures within 24 hours. Okay, right, which led the platform to remove the filter.
Wow. In educational settings, workshops and discussions are being organized to raise awareness about colorism. These initiatives aim to empower individuals to embrace their natural skin tones and challenge societal biases. So, how do we reckon with all of this? How do we dismantle these harmful systems? I think awareness is the only first step. For those of us with privilege, whether social, economic, or cultural, There is an ethical imperative to act. Like me, when I didn't care when my mom said you do not go for swimming in the scorching heat of July in Pakistan. I didn't listen to
Because tu kala ho jaoge.
because मैं काला हो जाऊंगा, yeah. So you have to stand up and you go for swim on a scorching heat in July.
Yeah, damn right. I mean, yeah, agreed. Privilege demands accountability. It requires us to challenge Eurocentric beauty standards, confront our biases, and amplify marginalized voices. That includes holding media industries accountable, supporting grassroots movements. Yeah, I think there was a resistance movement to Fair and Lovely in Pakistan. It was like dark is beautiful or dark is lovely or something like that. But yeah, I guess just, promote inclusive representations of beauty and identity. Like, come on, it's almost 2025. Like, enough of this nonsense.
Yeah. And of course, decolonization is essential, not just politically or economically, but culturally. We must re engage with Pakistani history, arts,
Pakistani.
and traditions that were erased under colonial rule, Pakistani and Indian, I would say. Pakistani identity should celebrate its inherent diversity rather than mimic Western ideals. Again, applies to the whole subcontinent.
Embracing old shades of brown is not merely a matter of aesthetics. It's a rejection of systems of oppression. It's about dismantling oppressive and systemic structures of power and cultivating a more equitable and inclusive society. DEI, baby. Let us not continue to latch onto colonial histories of violence. As Arundhati Roy wrote, our strategy should be not only to confront empire, but to lay siege to it, to deprive it of oxygen, to shame it, to mock it with our art, our music, our literature, our stubbornness, our joy, our brilliance, our sheer relentlessness, and our ability to tell our own stories, stories that are different from the ones we're being brainwashed to believe. The corporate revolution will collapse if we refuse to buy what they are selling. Their ideas, their version of history, their wars, their weapons, their notion of inevitability. Remember this, we be many and they be few. They need us more than we need them. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing.
That's amazing. And this is where we as individuals can make a difference. But we must also advocate for structural changes, whether through policy, education, or organizing and activism. Only then can we begin to reverse the harmful impacts of colorism and build a society that truly values the richness of human diversity.
The journey ahead is long, but it starts with dialogue, like the one we're having today.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Armpit Intellectuals. We hope this conversation has challenged your assumptions and inspired you to think critically about the issues we discussed. Join us next time as we continue to explore the complexities of identity, power, and resistance.
Take care and keep questioning. Also, if you're feeling generous and if you enjoy this episode and you like listening to the podcast, please consider buying us a coffee on Ko-fi. See the link in the caption.